about 10, 11 years ago, and it asks you questions, and then you just answer the questions, and it helps you to bring up memories so that you can record for your family. So to start with, one of the things that they ask is, where was I born? I was born in Tacoma, Washington. My name is Vernett. Housekeeper Simkins. Housekeeper is a middle name, and I don't ever use it for anything. And then it asks for circumstances of my birth, and some of the things that I wrote in here is that I knew it was a quick delivery, my mother said, and that I was covered with a very fine hair because I was 2 weeks late, and I've always had a lot of thick hair, and the hair rubbed off on my body within a couple of days. My brother and sisters were, my older sister, she's about 19 months older than me, and her name is Lois Ann Housekeeper Stacy, and she was born in 1940, and I was born April 28th, 1943, after her. And then Laval, she was born in 1941. And then Laval was born in 1945. And then my youngest sister, Carol Louise Housekeeper, Getchell was her married name. She was born in 1947. My parents were Louise Collard Housekeeper. My father was Cliff Henry Housekeeper, and you have to know that his name, Cliff, C-L-I-F-F-E. There's an E on his name, and he always corrected people because when the E was on there, they'd call him Cliffy, and he says, it's just Cliff. And if they left the E off, then he'd say, you spelled it wrong. So you have to know that there is an E on his name, Cliff. And then I think I'll skip where they were born, and it asked if we had any nicknames, and we did. My dad, my name is Vernett, but nobody ever shortened it. It was always has been Vernett. It was never Nettie or Vernie, but my dad called me Pet. So I was Pet, not Vernett. I think he did that because it kind of rhymed with it. My brother was Butch, and my sister, Lois and Carol, my two sisters, they didn't have a nickname that I knew. My dad worked construction as a hod carrier. Do you know what a hod carrier is?
Carry bricks for a mason?
No.
Oh.
You carried the plaster or the cement on a wheelbarrow up a ramp that was all the way up to the tops of buildings, and he mixed cement and took it to the builders, and he also worked as a plumber's assistant. My mother did part-time job. She worked at the school in a lunchroom sometimes. She also worked at a mink farm where she put the pellets of the mink on boards to stretch them out to dry. And she worked in a coffee shop, but most of the time she was at home. So to name the towns that I lived in before I was 20, and when we lived in Tacoma, we lived out in the country on Collins Road in Tacoma, Washington, until I graduated high school. So we moved there before I started school, stayed there till after I graduated high school. Then we moved to Olympia, Washington, where I lived until I married. My grandfather, Collard, died when my mother was 17. So I never had a grandfather on her side, and her mother died when she was 3. So I never had grandparents on my mother's side. And on my dad's side, my grandmother died when my dad was 13, and my grandfather died when I was about 7, and I only remember seeing him a couple of times before he passed away, and we went to his funeral. And so a little story about the grandparent thing. When I was growing up, my friends would say, oh, we're going to Grandma and Grandpa's for Sunday dinner, or we're having Christmas with Grandma and Grandpa. Never had a grandparent. Didn't even know what that was all about. And so I decided when I was a kid what grandparents were supposed to do and what they were supposed to be like. And so I decided that that's what I was going to be when I got to be a grandparent, because I had no idea, never having associated with anyone. So when I got my first grandchild, I had already made up my mind when I was a little girl what grandmothers were supposed to do. And so I've tried very hard to know all of my grandchildren really well and to be the kind of grandparent that my grandmothers would have been if they had lived. So I don't know if they would have been, but that's, in my mind, that's what they would have been.
That's cool.
And my mother can only remember one thing about her mother, because she was 3 when she died. She had really long, dark hair. It was brown, but it was so dark brown that it was almost black. And my mother remembers sitting there and brushing that long hair out with a hairbrush. And then my grandmother would braid it into a long braid that went down her back, and then she would swirl it up on her head. And I have the braid. When she passed away, they cut her hair off at the braid, and I have the braid in a little box, the box they originally put it in, which has got to be over 100 years old now.
Goodness.
And I still have the little box that they put it in, and it's just a cardboard box, and it's all twisted up. I have no idea what anybody is ever going to do with that braid. But I took it when my mother passed away because I remember the story, and I didn't have a grandparent, and I always wanted a grandparent, and this is as close as I could get, was to have my grandmother's braid. I've still got it. I don't know what any of you guys are going to do with it, but there it is. Aunt Carol. I have a sister named Carol, but my Aunt Carol, my dad's younger sister, came to live with us when she was in high school. We were living in Tacoma, Washington at that time, and it was just before Carol was born, and they named my sister Carol because she was born Christmas Day. They named her Carol, and they named her after my aunt who was living with us at the time. I remember, and this cousin, Bob Totten, I still have on Facebook, and I still converse with him back and forth. But when he was little, his dad used to go fishing all the time, and I won't forget this. We were there, and he's a couple of years younger than me, and his dad would always go fishing and bring the fish home and fry them up in a frying pan, and we'd eat them. Well, Bob was just a little guy. He must have been 4, 5 maybe. And he went and got the goldfish out of the goldfish bowl and put them in a frying pan on the stove to fry fish for dinner because he'd seen his dad do it. Yeah. So, and I remember that. That's one story I remember about him. Oh, well, this one's probably not such a good story for me. It shows how naughty, and I really wasn't very naughty very often. Well, I guess you'd have to talk to my sister Carol because she thought I was naughty most of the time. I was playing outside, and my sister Carol, who was younger than me, woke up from a nap, and my mother was outside hanging clothes on the line, and she said, "Go fix her a sandwich." I did not want to go in the house and fix her a sandwich. And I was busy playing, and she says, "No, you go in and fix her a sandwich." So I went in, stomping in, opened the refrigerator, and sitting right there in the front was a can of moist dog food. So I got out a bread, and I put this dog food on the bread, and I gave it to Carol for a sandwich. Only she complained because she didn't like the taste of the sandwich. So she took it to my mother, who was out hanging clothes on the line, and she smelled it, and right away she knew it was moist dog food. And so I looked up, and here come my mother with a branch broken off of the willow tree, and I got swatted on the back of my legs for giving my sister a dog food sandwich. And it said, "Who was the president when you were born?" Well, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was president from 1933 to 1945, and I was born in 43. So I was 2 years old when he was no longer president, and then it was Dwight D. Eisenhower after that. And that I remember that he came into office, and I remember wearing a button that said, "I like Ike." And he was He was there from 1953 to 1961 when I graduated high school. He was the president that I grew up with. President Roosevelt was the president that was there when I was born, but I don't remember him because I was only 2 years old when he was out. Where were you in the first presidential election? I was 19. I was in business school in Tacoma, Washington, and I voted for John F. Kennedy. That was the first time I was old enough to vote.
Do you remember when he died then?
Oh yes, it was a few years later, but yes, I remember when he died. Did you ever have an imaginary friend when you were growing up? No, I never did have an imaginary friend, but I made up lots of stories in my head. I told stories to myself in my head for years and years and years. I can remember doing that when I was a teenager, and a lot of them I did them just as I was going to sleep because it helped me to go to sleep. And I talked to animals, and I talked to flowers, and I talked to stuffed animals, and I talked to my dolls, and I truly believed that my dolls came alive at night when I was asleep. And if they were in a different position, it didn't scare me because I knew that they just didn't quite get back to where they were before so they were, but, and this one's kind of, I guess, maybe it's strange. I don't know that it's strange, but this is what I did. And I did this for a long time too. When I had clothes in the basket and I was hanging clothes on the line, if they were in the basket together, they had to be hung together because they were friends. So I would hang a shirt up, and then the next shirt had to go next to it because they were together in the basket. So I hung clothes according to who they were with in the basket, not according to if it was all shirts or all underwear. So the clothesline kind of was mismatched, but they were friends. So I don't know why I had this kind of imagination, but I always did. Did you and your brothers or sisters fight about, what did you fight about the most? We fought about who was the boss, and it was always me. I was the boss. I told everybody what to do until Laval got older, and he's 20 months younger than me, and he got older, then I couldn't boss him anymore because he got bigger. As he got older, he got bigger than me, and I remember he would wet towels in the little swimming pool we had in the backyard and swat me with them if I got too bossy. And they were wet and they stung when they hit you on the back of the legs. And Lois and Carol always let me take charge because they didn't want to anyway. So I was the one that made the plan that we were going to do. I told them how we were going to play, what we were going to play, and I even told them what to wear. If I didn't like what they were wearing to school, I'd tell them to go change. And I wonder where that comes from.
There's somebody very close to you.
And I even, when it came to weeding the garden or doing the dishes, I would tell them whose turn it was, and they just let me be the boss. But Laval and I stayed really close as friends, as well as being brother and sister, and we did everything together. I just didn't boss him anymore. He took care of his own self, and maybe that was part of the, Lois and Carol were more submissive, I guess, and Laval and I were not. So they kind of, the oldest and the youngest and the two in the middle stuck together. So, it says, what was the dumbest stunt you ever pulled with you or your brothers or sisters? This is an easy one. We were teasing a bull in the pasture, right next to our pasture. We were throwing rocks and yelling at it, which was really a stupid thing to do. Don't ever do that. And it jumped the fence. And it took off chasing us down the gravel road right in front of our house. And so I was screaming for Mom, and Laval was running alongside of me, but he wasn't screaming. And my mom come running out of the house waving, and she took her apron off and started waving it at the bull to distract him. And we ran into our yard, and then he ran right past us on down the road and out towards this was just a gravel country road that came to our house and the house next to ours. It wasn't a busy road, but he was running down towards the highway that was a few blocks down the road, and he ran right past us and down that way, and my mom had to go in and call our neighbor because if he got out in traffic, he could get run over. So my neighbor then had to come and get him, and believe me, never teased that bull again until they took him to butcher. It says, tell about the worst winter storm that you can remember as a child. Well, in Washington, snow was kind of rare, and it was very, very wet. It was like picking up snow that had been soaked in water. And so we would go through our gloves until they were soaking wet and couldn't use them anymore. Then we would go to my dad's sock drawer, and he had these big, thick work socks, and then we would put those on, usually 2 sets, and we'd go out and play in the snow again. And we had, in the corner of our living room, we had a big oil stove that heated the house, and it had a flat top on it, and we would bring the socks in and lay them all over the flat top to dry them so my dad could continue to wear them to work. And we did get a lot of ice storms though, and it would rain and then it would get freezing and then it would be so slick, and the rain that would be coming down would be frozen because it would be so cold that it would freeze as it was coming through the sky. And there was black ice. We called it black ice because you couldn't see it, so you had to be really careful when you were walking or driving because it was really slick, but you couldn't tell it was slick because you couldn't see it. And then we would get these windstorms, but they only came once in a while, but they would blow so hard that it would lift the linoleum in the kitchen on the floor, and that it would blow in under the door, and you could watch the linoleum go like this because the wind would get under it and lift it up, and it would go back down. Oh, hi. The next question that it asks about winter, it says, what did you use to go sledding down hills in the snow when I was a kid? Mostly we used cardboard boxes, but they got wet and broke apart. And sometimes if we had them, we used the inner tubes for tires. They don't use inner tubes in your tires like that anymore, but we did use inner tubes, but we didn't always have them available. And it asks, when you built snowmen, what did you use to decorate the snowmen? And we used our own hats, scarves, mittens, sticks for arms, and then we used rocks to put the eyes, the nose, and to form the mouth. And asked about if I ever went skiing in the winter, and no, never did go skiing, but we went sliding a lot on the frozen ponds, and you just had your boots on and you just slid across the ice, and your friends or your brother and the sisters would get behind you and give you a push and see how far you could slide just on your boots. We did a lot of that, but I never did have a pair of ice skates on until I was a teenager and went to ice skating rink. So and about school closing in the winter when I was a kid, it was closed more often because of ice than because of snow, because we didn't get that much snow. But when we did get snow, yes, people in Washington can't drive in the snow. They don't know how. And so they would close the schools, and we would just play outside. But it wasn't the kind of snow that we have here in Idaho. It was really, really wet. And it was, your clothes, everything just got soaked within a few minutes. And the name, Houskeeper, is German. And as far as we can find out, it had meant something about like a blacksmith, a keeper of a Houskeeper, which is the keeper of the blacksmith shop. So it was something like that. And so apparently somewhere back in our history, when they got their name, they were a blacksmith, and that's how they got the name Housekeeper. And it was pronounced Houskeeper then, and my brother insists that it's Huskkeeper. And so my maiden name is Housekeeper, but his name is Huskkeeper because he decided after he'd been married a few years that he was going to take that pronunciation. But I never did agree with him on that, so. And what was the most famous person I ever met when I was a child? It was a TV show, and the show was called The Cisco Kid. And he was a Mexican that wore the big Mexican hat and all the things with all the designs on it like Mexican wear. And he came to a store in our town, and we went to see him. And what a disappointment. His teeth were yellow, his hair was greasy. He was not the least bit impressive at all. And I never watched the Cisco Kid after that on TV because I was not at all impressed with this guy. And he didn't even act like he cared that he was there or that we were there. And then the only other I met two other famous people. One was Al Roker he came to a bank thing that we had over in Sun Valley one time, and he was a speaker, and he came and sat at our table with Dad and I. This was after we were married, and he was a really nice guy. And then one other time, we were students in Provo because we didn't have any kids yet, and we went to this pizza place. We had Drew, but he wasn't with us, and there was Marie Osmond. She was there with some friends eating pizza. We didn't talk to her, but we watched her. So those are the only famous people that I think I've ever met. What was the biggest fib that I ever told? Okay, I feel really bad about this one. I'm going to tell you, but I'm not sure you should tell the children. But anyway, there was a store across the street from our school, and it was a mom and pop kind of a little grocery store. And we used to go over there on our lunch hour and spend our money and get things to snack on. And I took the money that Mom sent me to take to school to pay for my books. And I was in the 2nd grade, I remember. And we had a fee that we had to pay on some books, and I took that money, and because I never had money to go to that store. I had money. I went over to that store, and I bought candy. And then I told the teacher that, and my mom, that I put the money in my desk, and someone took it. And I know they didn't believe me. I'm sure they didn't believe me. But I don't remember getting in trouble about it, but I never stole another thing again, ever. I was so traumatized by that I didn't even take any, when you could just grab a handful of grapes at the grocery store when you're shopping and say, oh, I'll just have a little of these. Never. I've never done that. I felt so bad about that money. So I guess it was a lesson well learned because I learned it. And then who had a big influence on my life? The one person, there were two people. One was a young women's teacher, and she was not necessarily attractive, but very nice. And she taught us in young women's, and she really, I always felt that she really understood us. And I can't even tell you her name. But the next person that had probably the most influence was Sally Hubert, that lived next door. There was a field, and then there was their house, and she had 4 little girls, and I used to babysit for her. And she was, I would go over to her house almost every day after school. I must have been a real nuisance because she knew I was going to come, but I came several times after school when I was in grade school, and I would play with her little girls. I think maybe she thought it was okay because she could get things done while I entertained her little girls. But she showed me how to clean house, really kept a clean house. And how to do my hair, how to dress, how to set a table, and I could talk to her. My mom, these things were not important. The dishes and things were just set on, pots were put on the table, and I never really liked that. And so when my children were all growing up, we had a soup tureen with a soup in it. No pot ever got put on the table. And you had long stem glasses set at the table for dinner. The silverware went on the proper side. We set an evening table every single night. And Sally taught me how to do all of that. And she stayed a friend of mine for years and years and years. Then her husband was killed in a trucking accident. He was a trucker. And he was killed in a trucking accident. And she married again after her kids were grown. And she married one of the teachers from the school. And we moved around a lot then, and I didn't see a whole lot of her. I'm sure she's gone now because she was 10 years older than me. And I'm 77, so she would be...
How old were you when you were going over to her house?
Oh, she would probably have been 20, 22, 23, and I'd have been...
Newly married.
Yeah, and I would have been 10, 12, 13, 14, all the way up through high school. Because she lived right there next door to us. She had a field and we had a field. So there was a couple of acres between our houses, and hers was a brand new house because they just built it on her father's land. And one of the reasons I think that she was so understanding is she had a younger brother that had Down syndrome, and the whole family had to deal with him. And he would sometimes get free and come to the neighbors. And he loved cars, and he would get in your car because you didn't lock your cars. He would get in the car. There's no way you could get him out. I mean, he was an adult. He was a teenage boy and older and really strong. And so his older brothers who were married and had families of their own, they'd finally come and say, we got to go home now. You got to get out of the car. No. And then he'd say, Mom's baking an apple pie for you, and it's almost done. You better come. Oh, then he would get out, and boy, there better be a pie in the oven when he got there. But he would, I was a little girl, before I was old enough to start school, we would go over to his parents' place to pay the water bill, because they were the ones that collected for the whole street. And he would be riding his very large tricycle around the yard, but he was a big kid. And he would say, I want to play with the little girl. I want to play with the little girl. He scared me to death. I didn't want anything to do with him. And I was 5, 6, and 7. And then it was, 3 or 4 or 5 years after that Sally built the house in her father's pasture right next to our house out in the country. And so then I would, but he lived. He outlived his parents. He moved in with Sally for a while, and then they had to put him in a home because he didn't do anything except sit, and they had to do everything for him. And then he finally passed away, but he lived into his 50s, and they didn't think he would ever get out of childhood, because he had a heart condition. But he lived into his 50s. So, but yeah, Sally, I really need to check and see whatever became of her. I have no idea. So the next question is asked, was a nickname given to you by your friends or classmates, and how did you get it? I never had my friends didn't have a nickname for me. I guess I didn't accept it. I told you that my dad called me Pet, but I never had a nickname. It was Vernett. 2 or 3 times people would try to shorten it to Nettie, and Grandma Housekeeper did that when I first met her.
Grandma Simkins.
I mean Simkins, yeah, why did I say housekeeper?
I was like, wow, on your birthday?
Yeah, so Grandma Simkins, when I first met her, she tried to call me Nettie, and I made it very clear to Dan's family that, no, I never go by Nettie, my name is Vernett, full thing, always. And that's the way it's always been. Like Daniel is Daniel, he's not Dan or Danny, he's
Yeah.
Daniel, so. What was some of my favorite foods when I was a kid? Pasta. I remember that I loved spaghetti and macaroni and cheese, but we didn't have macaroni and cheese like you get it in the box. My mother would cook macaroni, and then you bought that Velveeta cheese that was in the box, and then you cut that up, and you mixed it with milk and melted it down and poured it over the macaroni. That was our macaroni and cheese. And one of the favorite things that we had growing up was just macaroni with tomato sauce and butter and salt and pepper. And lots of times for lunch, Mom would just cook macaroni and pour a can of tomato sauce and melt some butter and salt and pepper in it, and that was it. And a slice of homemade bread, and that was lunch. And that was one of our favorite things.
We should try that again, that same kind of mac and cheese.
I've got that. I've got that box now because Gina brought me a box to melt down if I wanted to make that into a dip or something. But I should try that sometime.
Yeah.
But I also liked grilled cheese sandwich. Loved grilled cheese sandwich. Hated stew because when my mother made stew, she put parsnips and turnips and those nasty things like that in it. And I did not like cooked carrots. And cooked carrots I can eat now, and particularly if it's in a stew or something, I can eat cooked carrots. But I much prefer them raw than cooked. Always have. So, and we ate fish. I didn't know that you weren't supposed to like fish, and I ran into a lot of people after I left Washington who said, "Ooh, you eat fish?" Well, in Washington, we grew up with clams and oysters and fish and shrimp. You know, it was part of our regular diet, and we ate quite a bit of it and didn't know until we moved away from there. And then people would, "Oh, I hate fish. Why do you like fish?" I didn't know you were supposed to not like it. So, first boyfriend, it asked. Clyde Rushton. Blonde, blue-eyed. He was the oldest of 8 children, and he was a boyfriend only for a very short time, just a few months when I was in high school, and he ended up being a very close friend, and we did lots of things together, but it never clicked as boyfriend and girlfriend. But he moved to Mesquite, Nevada after he was older, and when we would go through there, we would stop and see him sometimes when Dad and I would go through on our way to Yuma to see my parents. And the funny thing, the Tucks across the street, when they moved here to town and they found out that they were from Washington, they knew the Russians really well. And they didn't know Clyde so well because he was gone, but the younger Russians, of the 8 younger ones, they went to school. She went to school with some of them, and so we can talk about the Russians. And Clyde's younger brother, Harold, died of this virus a week or 2 ago, and he lived in New Mexico. And
he had coronavirus?
But he was living in New Mexico, and he died there, not in Washington State. And he and his wife both got it. She survived, and he didn't. But he had a lot of health issues, and he was on oxygen, and so, but she survived it, he didn't, so. It asked about Valentine's Day. What did we do when we were kids about Valentine's Day? We decorated brown paper sacks, and we sat them out on the table. They were all, and then you go and put a Valentine, mostly the Valentines were homemade, and you'd make the Valentines yourself. I can only remember maybe a couple of times ever buying a box of Valentines from the store. And everyone went around and put a Valentine in each person's paper box. And then, now I think they make you put one in everyone so nobody gets left out. Then, if you didn't really like that person, you didn't give them a Valentine. So, and then we always had a party with cookies, cupcakes, candy, punch, and mothers came and helped. There were games, and they brought treats, and they helped us play games. That's what we did in school. But I remember homemade Valentines, and you didn't have to give everybody one. Because there were some kids I most definitely did not give a Valentine to. And then you were pleasantly surprised when you got one. Because they were homemade, they wrote their own sayings on them. And so sometimes they said really nice things, and sometimes they didn't say such nice things. What is the most special Valentine that I ever received? Oh yeah, I would not have remembered this. When we were married and he was in Vietnam, I had a guy come to the door. I had never had anything delivered to my door, particularly for me, and he brought a box of candy and flowers. And Dad had gotten a hold of somebody on the ham radio thing, who then forwarded it on across the country until it got to a store in Olympia, Washington, and it was somehow, I don't even know how he paid for it, but he did it somewhere through there. It got paid, unless he just mailed a check to him or what. But this guy came to the door, and here I got candy and flowers for my husband who was in Vietnam. I was so impressed. And I was also in tears. So,
That's cool.
um,
That's cool.
my first date, although Clyde Russian was actually what I guess my first real boyfriend, my real first crush, we never went out. I mean, we went to church things together, but he never asked me to go anywhere with him. But we would hang out at church activities when we got there. But we would both show up separately. So my first real date was the neighbor next door named Gary Fuller, and he asked me to go to the fair with him. And he was a friend, and although it was his first date, I think he figured it was easier to ask somebody that he was really friendly with to be his first date. And so I was his first date, and he was mine. And we went to the fair, but we're just friends. So, then it asked, tell about your first kiss. I remember thinking about that. I cannot remember exactly what or who my first kiss was. I just don't remember who the first boy it was. I just remember that I was kissed, and I guess he just wasn't very impressive, because I don't remember which one of these boys that it actually was. So, I don't know.
He's gonna see this video and be like, "It was me."
Yeah.
Like,
He'll never see the video. TV shows. What was my favorite TV show? There was the one called the Howdy Doody Show, and that was a puppet. And his name was Howdy Doody, and he was dressed in a plaid shirt, and he had red painted hair and very big, large white teeth. I liked that show. I remember that. And then the rifleman. He was so good looking. And it was a black and white Western. And then the one I think that I remember the most was Clint Eastwood in Wagon Train and The Virginian. And Clint Eastwood was in Wagon Train, and then the show The Virginian, and it was Trampas. was the name of the guy. I was always going to name a little boy Trampus, but when we came to start having children, I was never going to use that name. And his name was Rowdy Yates, the actor Rowdy Yates, but the character that he played, the name was Trampus, and I was so in love with Trampus. I think I was probably 13, 14, 15, 16 right in there. So those were my favorite shows. What were favorite family reunions? We went to a reunion in Draper, Utah, where my Aunt Carol lived and my Aunt Fawnella, and we had the reunion in their homes, part of it, and part of it was in a park. We did this a couple of times, and we had food and games, and they told stories on each other, and we had drawings for homemade gifts that they made. We had drawings and it wasn't an auction because we didn't pay any money, but your names all went into a hat, and then you could draw it out, and whatever it said, whatever it was that they had made, then you got to go and keep. So, what classes did I think were the most fun or the most enjoyable in school? Loved reading, loved English. I can still remember the rules. You know, I before E except after C, and all these rules. I knew all the rules in English, and where you put a comma or a semicolon, or I remember the rules where these go, and I loved history. I like to go back in history and see about people and how they lived and what they did, and so those are my two favorites. Hated math. Was not good at math, and I remember that my dad would say he was really good at math. He would do math problems in his head just for fun. And he never even got a high school education. And in fact, when I was in high school, he decided to go to adult evening classes, school, and my math teacher was his teacher. And he was always embarrassing me because he would give me things and said, here, take this home to your dad, have him work on this problem, and then he'd say, how come this is so hard for you when your dad can do it so simple? And then my dad did the same thing. He would help me with my math, and he'd say, how can you not understand this? I don't care. I don't understand it. I don't like it. And I took general math, and I think that was as far as I ever took. I didn't take any of the algebra or any of that stuff. Just general math. And I have never needed any of the others anyway, so I didn't worry too much about it. Spelling was another one that I didn't like. And to this day, I still have to think. I have memorized words because otherwise I wouldn't know how to spell them. I wasn't really good at spelling, and I didn't like science classes either, where they would be mixing all these things. Never liked any of those things. So I guess it was a good thing I didn't try to go into any of those fields. What was the biggest problem you remember having in grade school? I was really shy, and I got teased because of it, because I wouldn't speak up, and I kept to myself, and I was lousy at sports, and I never got picked to play on a team, because if the ball came at me, I either covered my head or ran out of the way. There was no way I was going to catch that ball and have it hit me in the face or something, so I wasn't any good at it. So I was always picked last. I had friends, quite a few friends, and a couple of very close friends, but I was never what they call part of the popular group. But that was okay. It didn't bother me. I don't think I wanted to be a part of them anyway, but the friends that I had were good friends, and we did things together. And never did do junior high. It asked what junior high was like, and I went right grade school through. We didn't even do kindergarten. Started in the first grade, went from first grade through the 8th grade, and then went right to high school. So we went to the little country school, Collins Country School, and then went to the high school. So Franklin Pierce High. And that age, junior high age, was not a good fit for me. That would probably be the first year of high school. I didn't fit in really well. I wasn't, I thought they were all kind of very immature and acted pretty darn stupid. And so maybe I was a little more mature or a little older, but the junior high age, I didn't fit very well. I did better in high school. So, a couple more of these and then we can, okay. What was the biggest problem that I remember having in high school? Getting from class to class, because our school was built with a walkway like this, and then their buildings went off like this. So you left a classroom, came out into the hallway, but if you had to go to another section, you came outside and you walked outside into the next set of buildings, and then you went in and you came out and walked into the next set of buildings and went in. And it would rain and you'd get wet and it would get icy, and they had the walkways would come like this and then go down to the next level. The number of times that you slipped and fell, zoom, going down those walkways. And the lockers were at one end of the school, and the classes were all in these buildings that were off of it. I think it was a California style that they built. So you had to go outside to go from section to section.
What school was it?
Franklin Pierce High School in Tacoma, Washington.
In Tacoma, Washington.
But the winters were not like California, so that was the thing I hated the most about it. And where was my favorite place to go to be alone? Two places. There was a field near my house that I could go and sit on this wooden bridge, and it went across this little creek, and there was a wooden bridge, and I could sit on the bridge and I could watch the farmer up there drive his tractor back and forth across the field. And I could sit there for hours, and my siblings did not know, how in the world can you do that? But I could sit there for hours on that wooden bridge, and it was just across just a little stream. And the other was a broken down dock that was out on Puget Sound Bay, and it used to be out into the water where boats would come up, but it was now in a place that it was hard to get into, so boats didn't come anymore. And I would drive my car when I was a teenager and a young adult, and I would drive my car there, and it wasn't too far from my house, and I would sit on the pilings and I would watch the tide go out and come in and think about what I was going to do with my life. And those are the two places that I went to be alone. Let's see. What place did you discover and build a haven for you or your gang? Well, that was easy. There was a pasture on our property, and there were some willow trees that would grow along the outside edge, and we would stomp. Mostly it was me, because I would build the house, and so I built it the way that I wanted it. And boy, you better not walk through the walls. And we would stomp. The grass would be up to your knees and up to your waist, and I would stomp it down until I had a living room, a kitchen, and so many bedrooms and a bathroom, and they had doorways that went in. But you better not walk through the walls, which was the tall grass, and you better not walk through there. And you could get down and sit on the ground, and you could be hidden, and they could not see you from when you were sitting on the ground and the grass was up. And so I could go in there, and my friends and I would go in there, and we could sit and visit, and my younger siblings didn't know where we were, couldn't find us.